Welcome. My name is Ashante Horton. I'm the NCSS Conference Services and Education Manager. Tonight's presentation is the third in the series, Religion, Social Studies, and You. The presenter is Mark Fowler of Tannenbaum. He's going to be discussing how you can get more out of the core and strategies for incorporating religion into your classroom. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Morley Balaji of the Hindu American Foundation to get the webinar started.
Thank you so much, Ashante, and welcome everyone who's joining us this evening. My name is Murali Balaji from the Hindu American Foundation. Very quickly, I just want to recap the first two webinars. The first was really a broader view on teaching about religion, led by Charles Haynes from the Religious Freedom Center. And then the second was really the idea of teaching of diversity and difference from Kristen Looney of Face to Faith. The next two sessions will really focus on bringing it all together. And this webinar series is shaped by Tannenbaum's 7 Principles for an Inclusive Education. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce my friend and the person who is going to really lead you to apply these principles in the classroom, Mark Fowler from Tannenbaum. So, Mark, take it away.
Thank you so much, Morley. First of all, if you all could just chat that you can hear me, because I want to make sure that the mute button really is off. So, okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone to this session, Religion, Social Studies, and You, Getting More Out of Core. This has been a really remarkable partnership that we are at Tannenbaum very excited to be participating in with the Hindu American Foundation, the National Council for the Social Studies, with Face to Faith, and with the Religious Freedom Center. I just wanted to give a quick word about Tannenbaum and our work. We are a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit. We're based in New York City, and you may occasionally hear some sounds from the city, i.e. sirens, etc. Hopefully no screaming, but you definitely may hear sirens from time to time. So don't pay any attention to them. I'm fine, and I'll let you know if I need to evacuate. But our organization is a secular and non-sectarian not-for-profit. So we're not a religious organization, but our mission is to combat religious prejudice. And we do that by providing practical tools and trainings and resources in the 4 program areas that you see listed on the screen. But in particular tonight, we're looking specifically at the intersection of religion and education in the classroom. I also wanted to just send an acknowledgement as well to the Nissan Foundation for supporting Tannenbaum's participation in this webinar series. So in terms of our objectives for the evening, you see them on the screen. With our first objective, we really want to try and share some strategies for engaging students in activities that have them take the lead in creating and, in the best of circumstances, self-managing the respectful learning environment that we want all young people to participate in. In our next objective, we're going to introduce you a little bit more deeply to our pedagogy, the 7 Principles for Inclusive Education. And our pedagogy provides, if you will, the framework for all of our curricula and our trainings. And in today's session, we want to use the 7 principles as a way to inform how you might include religion and religious identity in choosing materials to explore with your students, and perhaps even in the ways in which you might lead the discussion. And then finally, we want to take a look at the concept of global citizenship as a framework for discussing religion and religious identity through the content that you're already introducing to students. So those are our objectives for the evening. And we're going to go ahead and get started with talking about this idea of respectful learning environments. So this is going to be our first opportunity to use the chat feature as a community tonight. what I'd like is if you could begin to type into the chat box, make sure that you've signified under send to all participants. What are some of the obstacles that prevent you from or make you uncomfortable in addressing religion in your classroom? So let's just take a few minutes and hear from you all about what are some of the things that come up. What are some of the obstacles that prevent you from incorporating this idea, this topic, and this identifier into your classroom content? Okay, parents. Parents again, heated backlash from parents not wanting to offend anyone. Some students are raised in homes that are full of prejudice and are not open to ideas other than their own. That's probably every home in the United States of some degree. The school district itself, the immaturity of students, and thank you for teaching middle school. A general environment that's not open to differences. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And continue to type in your responses because there'll be other opportunities for us to use the chat feature during the rest of the webinar. What you see on the screen now is, if you will, some of the things that we already heard, but some of the other obstacles that educators have reported to us in the work that we've been doing around religion in the classroom for about the last 20 years. And what you see on this slide are some of the more common concerns that teachers have expressed. Some have talked about the concerns of parents, but the idea of not wanting to project beliefs onto students, that it's not their job, they don't want to offend anyone, they don't want to look ignorant for asking questions either about students or even sometimes of colleagues. They don't want to misrepresent another faith. They are not religious themselves, and so then find a challenge in fully integrating or talking about religion or religious identity. Religion, from their perspective, is usually a negative influence, and many people make that case in all of the work that we do, that when you look at the news or open a newspaper, whenever you see religion mentioned, it's usually in some negative form. Some educators are not really sure if it's appropriate or how it's appropriate, how to actually make the connection between content and the actual real life lived experience of religious people. And some educators just have a lot on their plate. They've got a lot going on, and trying to squeeze in another topic is a little bit daunting. So one of the things that we want to try and address and certainly communicate over the course of this session and through this entire webinar series is to begin to identify strategies for moving beyond, through, around, over, under, whatever those obstacles you've identified that get in the way of you addressing religion in your classroom. And taking a moment to look at an excerpt or some of the Common Core state standards that we think can provide a really great framework for making the case for or making an argument for why teach about religion. So the Common Core is fundamentally about student readiness and the degree to which students will be ready for college and careers after their K through 12 education. These three that we have highlighted on the screen are an opportunity for us to see how very closely the investigation or the inclusion of religion in content area can help to satisfy these state standards. That students who are college and career ready seek to understand other perspectives and cultures through reading and listening. And we know that culture and religious belief and expression are very closely tied together for a variety of faith traditions around the world. that students are able to communicate effectively with people of varied backgrounds. And from our perspective at Tannenbaum, that starts with the ways in which young people are introduced to the idea of religion and how is that experience for them in the classroom with their peers. Because often what they experience and model with their peers will indicate future behavior. And then finally, that students are able to evaluate other points of view critically and constructively. And again, this goes one to the idea of how are students engaging around the topic of religion when it comes up in the classroom. But also, we're not necessarily suggesting that students need to have the same opinion because they are individuals. They do come from homes where there is a very strong ideal or presence that may not be ours personally, but certainly it is one that can be shared in a respectful environment. And so that's what we're actually going for. That's the end result that we want to play with, if you will. So what's about to come up on the screen is another opportunity for us to use the chat feature. And with these three questions that you see on the screen, I'd like for you to just really answer the first one only. So if you can enter using the chat feature how you would respond to what does respect look like? What does the idea of respect physically look like? Okay, listening to each other, good eye contact. Let's hear from a couple of other people. A closed mouth and open ears. Now let's hear from one more person. Okay, students being able to face each other and recognize others as having the same feelings and needs, being able to agree to disagree. The look in the eyes is important. Okay, these are really great. Thank you for sharing all of these. I'd like to take this a little bit deeper and ask you, given what you've already shared, using the chat feature again, and focusing specifically on the idea of a behavior. What does respect look like? And you can answer any one of the questions on the screen at this point. What does respect look like? What does it sound like? And what does it feel like? But be clear, we really want to focus in on the behaviors that you could observe a student either doing or not doing. So take a minute and see what comes up for you with some of these other responses. Okay, so you feel appreciated and valued. Respect sounds like a warm, welcoming tone of voice. And let me just say about the first two responses that come in. So when you think about how, if you feel appreciated and valued, what does that actually look like? And in terms of that welcoming tone of voice, perhaps, it may sound, the welcoming tone of voice is going to sound a little bit different to each of us. Sounds like earnest questions. Okay. And then again, there's a little bit of subjectivity that we have in what's an earnest question, but I don't want to split hairs. I know what you mean, but you can see that when we're talking about looking at the behaviors, encouraging body language, smiling and nodding, including students who are different from themselves in conversations and activities. So you could actually see a student go and include someone. That would be a behavior. Showing interest in the ideas of others. That could be anything from raised eyebrows to head nodding, all of those kinds of things. What's really key here is that we're focusing on behavior as opposed to thoughts. Because fundamentally, as much as we might think that we all have the same idea about what respect is or what it looks like, sounds like, or feels like, the student experience is that they have their own idea, and what we want to do is to get them engaged in an activity that allows them to come to consensus about, at least in your classroom, what does respect look like, sound like, and feel like, and have them take ownership of the process. So what you see on the screen now are the responses that were created at a school that we worked with in Long Island. And the this lesson, and this is a free downloadable lesson, it's called Respecting Each Other. It's on our website. This is really intended for teachers to facilitate a conversation rather than um, to make you come to the consensus. You want students to come to the consensus, but you constantly want to be drilling down with them. Are they identifying behaviors or are they identifying ideas? And this lesson will take your students through how to identify the behaviors that reflect what respect looks like and sounds like and feels like for them. And then all of their responses then become the foundation for class contracts. So what you see on the slide are the results of teachers in a K through 6 school at every grade level engaging students in this activity. The principal of the school noted to us that she believed that the exercise was successful when, after the students had engaged in this particular work, she found two girls, two third grade girls, who were actually creating rules of respect for their friendship. And whether you call it rules of respect, or whatever you call it, it should be something that is student generated. And then again, in the best of all worlds, you will also be able to create, well, what are the consequences? How do we manage this with integrity when students don't follow these prescribed ideas that the class has agreed upon? So let's take this just a little bit further, or another ideal, if you will. So when these are called Stendel's guidelines, or the 3 rules for a religious understanding. And there are 3 premises, if you will, that are a really great framework for introducing to students when you're introducing ideas around religious belief, or the ideas that religion can sometimes bring up. The first one, when you're trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion and not its enemies. And so when you're trying to find out information about a religion that's not yours or that you're unfamiliar with, don't ask the people who are critical of that tradition, ask the people who actually practice that tradition. The second, don't compare your best to their worst. So sometimes the interactions you may hear among students, and sometimes some adults that you know, is that people will compare what they believe to be the best of their own religious beliefs or traditions or practices, and compare it to the worst things that may be reported about another tradition's practices. Comparison is the kiss of death, because everybody's got some good and some not so good in their beliefs and practices. So you want to provide the space for people just to examine the tradition without comparing it to another one. And then leave room for holy envy, which I think is really a great idea. What it means, what holy envy means, is that we should be open to finding within a tradition that we're unfamiliar with, if you find something that's attractive or that there are elements within it that you wish were in your own tradition, being able to acknowledge that, and talk about that, as opposed to pretending that any tradition is perfect and others are incomplete, if you will. So these are some of the strategies that we work with teachers around and recommend, because if you will, it takes a little bit of the onus off of you as the facilitator in the room and gives some experience to the students to begin to manage themselves around these ideas. So now we want to talk a little bit more about the pedagogy, the 7 principles themselves. So on the screen, you see all 7 of the principles, and in a moment, some of them have actually already been introduced on the earlier webinars that our colleagues Charles Haynes and Kristen Looney led in the first 2 webinars, so we'll talk about that. But all 7 of the 7 principles you see on the screen: teaching all students, exploring multiple identities, preventing prejudice, promoting social justice, choosing appropriate materials, teaching and learning about cultures and religions, and adapting and integrating lessons appropriately. And we like to think about the seven principles. One, it is the framework for all of the training delivery that we do, as well as the curriculum development that we engage in. We see the seven principles both as a point of reflection for the educator, as well as instructional resource and guide for students. So we'll be covering several of the principles tonight in more detail and trying to make connections between the work some of our colleagues have done earlier. You'll also notice that we have identified 6 behavioral learning outcomes that are associated with the 7 principles. And they're not kind of like a one-to-one, but our theory is, and it's ongoing, that as teachers begin to employ the use of the 7 principles in their classroom instruction and design, then these are some of the outcomes that they can see with their students. And we have some very modest research around that. The 6 behavioral outcomes were really created as an ongoing benchmark for us so that we would be able to see the changes in students as a result of the work that we're doing with educators. Attentive listening skills, maintaining curiosity, and developing an appreciation of differences. One of the things that sometimes happens, particularly with religion as a topic, but in the overall learning process, is that young people lose a lot of the curiosity that they have about differences as they grow older. We want to make sure, to the degree that we can, that the curiosity that young children have is supported and developed throughout their educational experience. Asking respectful questions. And this goes a little bit to the idea someone had mentioned earlier about the immaturity of students. We want to provide frameworks and models for them to ask questions so that even in an immature moment, there is an established framework for asking about differences that they may be unfamiliar with. Debunking stereotypes. So the whole idea of young people having the skill sets to be able to dismantle the components of stereotypes, noting that we might have generalizations that are based on experience, but when generalizations become fixed and we don't seek out any additional information, that's kind of the quick road to stereotypes. And also being able to identify language that can be counterproductive to generalizations and learning, like all people or my people would never or them or they, and just distancing people and creating them as another group. Recognizing difference as a state of being. So, I think it's more the case that where we've disagreed or where we might find disagreement with people is not in where we're the same. We disagree with people when we notice and identify a difference. But we want to encourage young people to recognize that in a variety of ways we are different. And a lot of work has been done, and good work, within the world of multicultural education around how we're the same. But I think that, and our position is that we want to strengthen the skills for students when they notice difference between themselves and others without rushing to judgment. And that there is religious diversity so often, and we see it in a lot of the national and international statistics, that there is a lack of knowledge and a lack of religious literacy around exactly how diverse we are as a country and how diverse we are as a global community in terms of religious idea and belief. And so these are the 6 learning outcomes, behavioral learning outcomes that we're seeking to achieve in our work, and hope that educators that work with us can begin to see in their students. In webinar 1, our colleague Charles Haynes, in his session, Getting Religion Right, spoke about the idea of living with our deepest differences. And this harkens to Tannenbaum's first principle of teaching all students. Part of both Charles's idea and our principle is acknowledging where we're different. And so when thinking about teaching all students in the classroom, we become interested in the learning styles that each student brings into the class, and our ability as educators to design lessons that include all of the ways in which students learn. So one way to do that, for instance, in a pre-lesson, is to provide students the opportunity of answering a key question both visually or kinesthetically, and then encouraging all students who are witnessing to listen closely and be able to share what they heard about what their peers talked about. In the second webinar, Kristen Looney from Face to Fate's work, talked about the essentials of dialogue and the primary tool that dialogue can be. And it's interesting because this links very closely with our principle of teaching and learning about cultures and religions in the ways in which dialogue takes place. They've certainly advanced, given the technology that we have access to, and the virtual meetings that Face to Faith creates allows students this experience to get to know each other in the here and now, as opposed to the stock figures located at a particular point in time that so often the books that we're charged with using create. So you might ask yourself right now, think for instance, what are the depictions of students from India in the books you currently use or in books that you may have seen? And just ask yourself the question, do they depict life if you got off the plane in Bangalore at the airport? Does that book reflect the real life experience of how people are living? And if not, then those virtual exchanges that organizations like Faith to Faith engage young people in allow for teaching and learning about cultures and religions over a span of time, not just located in a historical moment. So talking about one of our other principles, choosing appropriate materials and thinking a little bit more about the Common Core, the text to world connection and using primary resources. So allowing students to form their own opinions about topics. So it was very interesting, this recent example, not as recent now, in February at the National Prayer Breakfast, there was a lot of hubbub, if you will, around President Obama's comments and some of the references that he made to slavery and the history of slavery in the United States. And if you remember the event and the news coverage that was surrounding it, you can see that there was a lot going on, but here was an opportunity to make a text-to-world connection between his actual full speech and allowing students to form their own opinions based on the speech, not on the commentary around the speech, or not even on popular opinions around the speech. Another principle that we have, preventing prejudice, has to do with, again, giving students the tools to be able to identify areas where stereotypes can arise and having a very active and working vocabulary around diversity, but also prejudice and bias, discrimination, etc. So our goal in this is to combat stereotypes and to hopefully reduce bullying. So we see a lot of news coverage of atrocities that are committed in the name of religion. And those can lead students to make generalizations about particular belief systems, and in the worst case scenarios, for students to engage in bullying of classmates who are perceived as representing those belief systems. And then one of the best ways we think to counteract such stereotypes and the hateful behavior that's presented is to offer positive images and voices that display the diversity and compassion within each religious tradition. So we want to expand what young people are experiencing and not just leave it to sound bites. In this photo montage that you see on the screen, this was taken from a letter in the New York Times that was entitled, "What Can Muslims Do to Reclaim Their Beautiful Religion?" And it was signed by Muslim leaders around the world who asserted that their duty to affirm and promote universal human rights, including gender equality and freedom of conscience. So this would be a great statement to share with students, and even being able to have students review that article and decide for themselves where are the stereotypes and how might someone combat them. In promoting social justice, one of the key ideas around this is that young people are very good evaluators of what they find to be just or fair. And so we want to expand their thinking so that they're not just thinking about what's fair for me, but begin to expand the idea what's fair for all of us. What does justice look like for all of us that are in the classroom community and the school community? We want to begin to model that. Again, current events are a great source of making that text to world connection and then making connections across time and place. Some of the current events that you see are related to discrimination and abuse against particular identity groups. They really provide a great opportunity to teach students about past injustices and human rights movements, exploring the role that religion has played both as a negative and a positive force in the struggle for equality and dignity can help students develop a more sophisticated understanding of the complex role that religion has played and continues to play in history and in society. And we can see in these two examples that we have up on the screen, in the ongoing history of the African American people and the struggle for freedom and equality. So the slide shows a picture of multi-faith support both during the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, as well as more recently, members of the clergy participating in protests in Ferguson, Missouri. And events like these provide a really great opportunity to spark discussion in your classroom. And it's so important to, I think for any one of us, if we think back to our own learning experience and perhaps even today, when we come across something that is particularly moving or jolting, we may think that it has just happened for the first time. And while students may know the words civil rights movement, they may not remember the intricate way in which religious belief and ideal and identity was interwoven into both actions that people took as well as stances that they made. So this was a moment, if you will, to make that text to world connection over time and place where we see similar kinds of engagement by people who are leaders within religious communities. So we want to talk a little bit about this idea of global citizenship. And this first slide will go back to the chat box and ask if you can type in some single words that come to mind when you hear the phrase global citizenship as it relates to your content. So preferably single words that come to mind when you hear the phrase global citizenship as it relates to your content. Communication, legal, inclusive, perspective. Let's hear from a few more people. Diversity, knowledge, cultural diffusion. It's really great. Thank you for sharing all of those. I'm going to ask you to consider for a moment, and you don't have to use the chat feature with this, but just consider for a moment, if I can advance the slide. Yeah. Who is a citizen? Let's take a moment and think about all of the characteristics of a citizen. And now consider, what are the rights of a citizen? What are the responsibilities of a citizen? What are the roles a citizen can take or play? And how do you address this topic in your current curriculum? And what we want to do is begin to build a little bit of a foundation or structure for perhaps using global citizenship as a lens, as a tool, as a pathway for including religion in your and religious identity in your classroom instruction. So the Asia Society, one of our partners, we respect their work so much, have outlined 4 competencies of global competence for students. And these competencies reflect students' knowledge, skills, and their disposition. So, if you will, some of the things we've been talking about, that it's not just what they know, but that there are skill sets that the students have, as well as a disposition, as well as a character about the idea of global citizenship. That students would be able to investigate the world, that they can weigh perspectives, that they can communicate ideas, and that they can take action based on what they've investigated, on where they've come out in terms of weighing perspectives, and be able to communicate those ideas. So we're offering some suggestions here for ways in which to use these competencies or to think about these competencies perhaps in the work that you're already doing with students. So in terms of investigating the world, and if you will, also going back to one of our 6 behavioral outcomes, knowing that there is religious difference, perhaps there's an activity that you could engage young people in where they look at what is the actual religious makeup of the world today, using verifiable primary sources and research. How many Christians are there in the United States, in the globe? How many Muslims are there around the world? Where are the largest concentration of Muslims in the world? These are the kinds of questions that can support both the development of the skill set, but also adding to their own knowledge around what is the state of religious diversity today. In terms of weighing perspectives, there's so many different things that are happening right now. The decisions that are being made, marriage equality, prayer in schools, Muslim holidays added to school calendars. It just recently happened in New York City and likely will be happening, I would imagine, or at least it's a question in other places around the country. What do students feel about that? How do they actually weigh perspectives without leading into stereotyping, being mindful of the language that they're using, and again, using primary sources, not just relying on how they feel? Communicating ideas instead of I think versus we think. That there is first my own opinion, but can we come to some consensus, at least around the data and the information that's being shared? What do we all think? What is our common belief about a particular topic? And then in terms of taking action, service learning is a really great opportunity for young people to investigate and learn about communities and religious communities around the school or that are part of the school community, as well as video conferencing opportunities like the Face to Faith program. So what you see on the screen, and I hope that you can see it, it may be a little small, but I'm going to go through all of these stages and talk a little bit more about them. These are this is the cultural identity typology, which was created by Dr. James Banks, who's a member of our program advisory council. And in each of these stages, what he began to outline was what are some of the stages that are somewhat fluid. So if you can see that there is an up and down arrow on the left column of this image, there are arrows going left to right, so that this is not just about kind of like moving to one stage and getting better and moving to another stage, but at any point in time, depending on the culture that you find yourself immersed in, you could find yourself in any one of these categories, any one of these areas. So the first area is called cultural psychological captivity. And in that stage, in that part of the typology, students or individuals will experience internalized negative stereotypes and beliefs, a very low self-esteem in terms of themselves and how they relate to the world. In the next phase is called cultural encapsulation. So there is a burgeoning sense, there's more of a sense of some pride within a cultural group, but it still is at the level of our group is better than yours. And there still is a question lurking in the background of, am I really proud to be a part of this group? So to a degree, the cultural pride is not like firm. It's almost a little bit of bravado. We move to the next phase, cultural identity clarification, is that stage where a person clarifies for themselves, develops their own attitudes about their own group, separate and apart from others, from what others in the group say. And it is the development, and it also is the experience and the expression of genuine cultural pride within that group. At the next stage, biculturalism, we see that people develop in having a healthy sense of their own cultural identity, but there is a desire to function effectively in at least two cultures, to learn what it is to navigate not just their own culture, but to be interested and curious about another culture. In the next phase, multiculturalism and reflective nationalism, you see that personal, cultural, and national identification. So it's no longer just thinking about, I am a member of this one small group. The identification begins to expand, that I see myself within my culture. I see myself as part of the national culture as well. And that there are positive attitudes, not just towards the group that I belong to, but I hold positive attitudes towards other racial, cultural, and ethnic groups. If you will, if you think back to Stendhal's guidelines, that it is that space of holy envy where you're able to identify and appreciate, sometimes even celebrate what you see as unique and powerful in another tradition or in another cultural group. And then this last phase is called globalism and global competency. And another way to talk about it in parentheses is cosmopolitanism. And Dr. Banks describes this stage as one in which civic culture of the nation and of the global community. So there is an active understanding and actions taken on behalf of people and groups from around the globe. And that for the person who is operating in this stage, there is a primary commitment to social justice wherever someone finds themselves, and that everyone should be able to participate in those same activities. So I'd like for you to consider for a moment, where would you say your students are in this typology? Thinking about this framework as a framework, not the framework, but as a framework for global citizenship, where are your students? In which stage? And then consider, which stage are you teaching from? Are you teaching from a stage that may be around cultural identity clarification, or is it maybe locked into cultural encapsulation? Or are you teaching from globalism and global competency? And then which stage are you teaching to? So there's a difference between where you're teaching from and what you expect students to actually grasp, how you expect them to respond. Which stage are you teaching to the stage of cultural psychological captivity, where is this very limited expression and experience of pride? And thank you. So stage 2, stage 1, thank you for chiming in on that. I appreciate that. So I want to open up this part of the conversation to the chat feature and ask, what are some of the topics you could cover that would begin to expose your students to the concept of globalism and global competency? So is it global history? Is it the War of 1812? What are some of the content areas where you could see exposing students to this idea of globalism or a commitment to justice for people around the world? So education within the culture based on religion. So you teach ancient history, including world religions. We focus on the Eastern Hemisphere. Absolutely. Great. Thank you for that. Let me share with you some of the things that we came up with. Current events, using news stories, focusing on current injustice. Using news stories, focus just solutions to issues. Teaching a lot of current events, so focusing on current injustices throughout the globe. These are some that we came up with that may or may not be on your radar. Environmentalism, there's a great deal of work being done around environmentalism, and very similar to that slide where we were looking at the civil rights movement and clergy marching and protesting in Ferguson. Environmentalism has very unique connections to different religious traditions, a commitment to the earth. The Arab Spring is an opportunity to talk about globalism because, for someone who's, let's say, 16, what is their relationship to the idea of actually protesting in the street for what you believe to be your rights, or how you would like your government and your local government to act? Global economics. One of the biggest things that the financial crisis showed us was the interrelatedness of all economies around the world. International trade agreements. Who's doing business and who's actually benefiting from the business that's being done. The UN Charter for Children's Rights. Any civil war that is going on can be related to a civil war that has taken place already. The UN Charter for Global Democracy. Climate change efforts, a great deal of work and a lot of information and current events around climate change efforts, but this is not the first time that the climate has changed. So, what is the history of that? Religious freedom, broadly writ. So we see a lot of conversation going on with states in the kind of ongoing debate about religious freedom restoration acts and how are they going to employ them without necessarily making them discriminatory towards groups of people. But what's interesting is that the original case was around Native Americans' use of peyote. So even trailing the history of the religious freedom acts that we see going on now, how are they different and the same from the initial efforts? Women's rights across time and space, and then access to education globally. Because I think that that's certainly one of the things and one of the topics that continues to be something that young people can talk about and even see themselves or see some aspect of their own personal history. So these are just some topics for consideration that you might consider introducing to content that you're already doing, or making it a part of content that you're already doing, as a way to explore the idea of globalism and global competence. When we talk about global citizenship, another opportunity that it provides is around young people having what the American Academy of Religions calls a basic understanding of the central texts, beliefs, and practices of the world's major religions. And when we talk about a basic understanding, we're not talking about people knowing chapter and verse, but we really are talking about what are the basics, what's the basic understanding of a religious tradition, knowing that there is a role that religion plays in history, politics, and social and cultural structures, and that that role is not always negative. That if we look at some of the institutions, even the ways in which the law is set up, that governments are set up, often have a relationship to religious practices and religious ideas, and that the diversity that exists within religions, not just among religions. So it's important that young people know that if you meet someone who is Muslim and they share something about their life with you, that that is the conversation that you had with one person, and you cannot ascribe that experience to every Muslim in the world. That there is a great deal of diversity that exists within traditions, and that that is worth knowing as well. So as we begin to conclude this session and come to the end of our hour, something to remember about the whole idea that we talked about in the beginning of our objectives for the evening in terms of examining strategies. Strategies for creating a respectful learning environment can be introduced at the beginning of the unit. They can be reinforced throughout a unit, that whatever you create at the beginning of the year has to have some kind of reinforcement on a regular basis. The 7 principles for inclusive education can provide a framework for examining current efforts to include religion in content. And we really do encourage educators to kind of play with them. So there's the way we present them, but then there's what you're going to see as you begin to explore these ideas in a more concrete way. And then finally, that global citizens are concerned with social justice. And so, in trying to use global citizenship or globalism as a lens for including religion, one of the places that you might look at accessing that information is from the idea of promoting social justice and what's fair for everyone versus what's just fair for me. In terms of our next session, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some case studies, share some very specific lesson plans with you across grade level, talk a bit about how to respond to students or what are some of the management tools that you can engage with in the classroom when topics around religion come up. And we want to, if you will, broaden the landscape of teaching about religious events in the United States a bit. So, we have a sense of what you may already have to cover, but we want to give some suggestions and kind of broaden that landscape to consider being able to substitute an event or maybe draw some comparisons to events that are not currently covered in the content in which you engage in. And our next webinar is going to be on next Tuesday, April 21st. At 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And we have about 5 minutes left before we officially close. So if you have any specific questions that you'd like us to address, I'm happy to take those now. So there's one question, can you get the PowerPoint presentation? I believe so, and Ashante can give us the specifics about how that happens. And there are a number of resources that I mentioned throughout the session. So those are all of it, all I think are available on our website. And if there is something that's not on our website, we're happy to send it to you. And thank you, Ashanti. So yes, you will receive a copy of the recording, so you'll have the slides as well. So the question is, the diversity within religions can be very complex. What's the best way to approach this idea? One of the things that we talk about when we're doing trainings, not just in education, but in our other program areas, is to talk about religion as a fluid experience as opposed to a fixed identity. So some statistics that we know about, and the Pew Forum is a great place for statistics around religion. But one of the things that we know is about 37% of people, I think, in the United States are actually in interfaith marriages. The number is higher if you think about people who marry within Protestant traditions but are of different denominations. The number of people who practice a tradition different than the one that they were born into is somewhere close to 50% of people in the United States. So I think one place to start is with facts, that there is a great deal of diversity within and among traditions, that a person's experience within their own religiosity can change over time, and that the larger goal is not about accepting everything, but really understanding that there is diversity, that people are different, and the goal is for us to be able to talk about our differences in ways that are respectful, and that respectful way, if you will, is something that can be created. It may not exist, but it is something that students have the power and the skill sets and the tools to be able to do. Okay, so I think that our time is just about up. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be with you tonight.